I never knew my parents. I do remember my mom a bit. She disappeared when I was little, and my father, well, I heard he left on the day I was born. Some even connected the dots that my father had something to do with my mother's disappearance. But I wouldn't know. So I was raised by my grandparents. They were strict but very loving. Particularly, I enjoyed spending my time with my grandfather. He taught me a lot about growing into a man, showed me how to shave and talk to women. He even taught me how to deal with the heartache of my first breakup. I knew since my grandparents were much older than me, I didn't have as much time as I would have wanted, but I cherished every minute that was available. When I was 16, my grandfather was diagnosed with some type of dementia. It was noticeable. His mind seemed to wander, bringing up the weirdest things. It broke my heart to see him in such a way. Even more terrifying was the fact he seemed to be aging at a rapid rate. By the time I had finished high school, the man I looked up to was a mere shell of his former self, needing assistance from me or my grandmother in every other way. This is when he started to say the most bizarre things. "I got lost in the garage again," is something he would usually tell my grandmother. I could tell by the look on her face how exhausted she was, constantly looking out for him, especially since he seemed to disappear quite frequently. Once we couldn't find him for almost 8 hours. We were absolutely frantic. We phoned for the police, but like usual, we would find him hiding in one of the corners of our garage. I've always hated our garage. Something about it always left me feeling angst, especially when I was a kid. I remember my grandfather sending me to fetch something from our second fridge that was stored in the garage. To get there, I had to walk down a small corridor that connected to the small carport of our home. I don't know why it was built this way, but it was each time that I had to cross that dimly lit threshold, I would hold my breath with pure trepidation. Though nothing ever happened, I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The shadows that danced around the corners of my peripheral were all in my mind, but I would typically quicken my pace once getting closer to the garage door. Once stepping inside, my anguish wouldn't completely relent. The sense of emptiness simmered in the air as a stale stench penetrated the atmosphere, leaving the small space completely devastated. Although nothing ever happened, I would always get whatever I went in to retrieve and storm back as quick as my small legs allowed. Though this day was slightly different. This is the day I first noticed the statue. It was odd, out of place since my grandparents weren't much of art collectors. But even more disturbing was how lifelike the statue was. It was of a woman. The sculpture stood about 4 feet tall, and during that time it was practically my height. So when I entered the garage, I was face to face with the most horrifying scene. The statue itself looked just as terrified as I was, the woman brandishing a gaze of pure horror. I could literally hear her screams in my imagination. To say the least, I almost wet myself. I didn't bother getting what my grandfather sent me in to get. Instead, I ran back, crying. That's when I collided into my grandfather. He grabbed me by the shoulder firmly and stared right into my eyes. "What is it, boy?" he asked with some stern voice. I continued crying as my muffled words stumbled all over each other, trying to tell him about the horrid statue. I think he understood what I said, because that's when he smacked me across the face. Rather hard. Say what you want about the older generations, but they don't tolerate nonsense. So, thinking back on it at the time, I didn't blame my grandfather for doing what he did. After hitting me, he dragged me back to the garage by my arm, practically breaking it off my small body. He then shoved me towards the statue, bringing me once again face to face with the nightmare. "Look at it, boy. It's just a statue. It ain't gonna hurt you," he angrily told me. In the moment, I felt silly for ever being scared of it, and quickly wiped my tears away as I gathered myself. "Where did you get it, Grandpa?" I whimpered out. He snorted, then garnished the hugest smile I've ever seen him make, as if I had asked him some profound question. "I collect beautiful things, son. The more beautiful, the more I want it," he told me as he brushed his hand across the statue's terrified expression. That's when his once smile dropped and his stoic frown returned. "Don't you touch them. You hear me? You leave them be." I did as I was told, and from that day on, any time I had to go into the ill-fated garage, I would just ignore the statues. Seeing that my grandfather appeared to collect more of them, each one demonstrating its own expressions of fright, I became so numb to it all, even though the feelings of dread would linger at the times when I had to enter the small room. Even when I got older, it always felt as if those statues were staring at me, their eyes following each step I took. I asked my grandmother about them once, and she told me the same thing my grandfather did, that he liked beautiful things. "But those aren't beautiful, they're abysmal," I told her. "I guess beauty is in the eye of the beholder," she told me with her tired voice. Something even more odd were how the statues would constantly change. Sometimes my grandfather would have several, and other times he might just have one, and each time it would be of a different woman, but always with the same look of terror. My curiosity for the abnormal works of art never evaded me. I just learned to look away whenever I had to go in there, mainly to look for my grandfather. As the dementia took hold of my male role model, I used the opportunity to start tossing away the monstrosities, each time sneaking one out the back and disposing of it in our trash bin. Neither of my grandparents were the wiser. Oddly enough, the statues kept appearing, even with my grandfather becoming more senile. Was somebody bringing him the statues? Perhaps the artist, I pondered. I never really thought about who was actually creating these hideous sculptures. That's when I decided to thoroughly inspect each one of them, searching for the creator's name. I picked up the statue and turned it around in almost every direction, but couldn't find any indication of a signature. I don't know why, but I then stared directly into the eyes of the small creation, her eyes bellowing out some desperation, and in the moment, something about the woman seemed strongly familiar. I started to think perhaps my grandfather himself was the artist. But if that was the case, what did he mean when he said he was a collector? Maybe my grandmother was sculpting these nightmares, but that still didn't make sense. The mystery of the origins of these lifelike statues captured my attention, and I became a bit overwhelmed with the concept of getting to the truth. Against my own judgment, I set up a wireless camera in the hellscape of a garage, hoping to see the person that was bringing my grandfather's sculptures. I reviewed the footage every day after work, but never saw anything of significance, except for once my grandfather cautiously entered the garage, slithering across the point of view of the camera. He then seemed to disappear. The camera was a wide lens and practically captured all corners of the garage. The only thing I couldn't see were the dark shadows in the corners. I fast-forwarded the next several hours, but still, the garage lay vacant, my eyes glued to the computer screen, as the lines of forwarding progress jived around until finally, there he was. To my astonishment, he appeared out of nowhere. I rewound the video to that exact moment he seemed to manifest, and I noticed there was a time glitch in the recording, about a 3-second lapse. I was left bewildered on how my grandfather could suddenly appear in a matter of seconds. I grabbed my chin as I softly stroked it in deep thought, trying to figure out what this all meant. As the months passed, my curiosity faded. Seeing how ill my grandfather was, supporting the family became my main focus, after all. That's all I had. Though the statues just kept showing up. No matter how many times I threw them away, they'd still seem to haunt me. While the garage kept his menacing presence, deeply wedged in the place I called home. Then the unthinkable happened. My grandmother suffered from a stroke, and she didn't make it. It was a nightmare. The only mother I've ever known, now gone. Now it was just me and my grandfather, alone in the house. I had to watch his every move since he kept disappearing. To say the least, I was devastated. Not only was my family falling apart, but I was exhausted. Taking care of somebody you love as they just wither away is something that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It is truly life-shattering. This is when my inquisitive mind returned on the garage, only because that's where I would always find my grandfather. I got lost in the garage again. Yes, Granddad, I know, I would tell him. This went on for the next year. By this point, he could hardly walk. At times, I would catch him crawling towards the ill-fated dark corridor that led to the small room. I would have to grab him by the arm and forcefully pull him away. I was getting tired and contemplated the idea of boarding off that part of the house. That's when the most mystifying question dawned on me. If I locked the garage, would the statues just keep piling up? Would they inundate the small space and explode through the walls? I quivered in disgust, imagining such a thing. I got lost in the garage again. Yeah, Granddad, I know. You're safe. I told him as usual, though this time he had something different that I've never heard him say before. They always get lost. I don't let them follow me. That got my attention. I didn't know who he was talking about. Who were they? What did you say, Granddad? I softly whimpered out. He didn't repeat what he said. Instead, he looked at me with a vacant stare. I don't know why I would think what he said meant anything. It wasn't long after that moment did the illness take its toll on my hero. He passed away. Seeing him lying still in a coffin was the most surreal moment of my life. A man that was fearless, laid alone in a world I only could hope was treating him good. Loneliness engulfed the small home, as most of the time I kept the lights off. I didn't want to see anyone. Not that there was anyone to see. I quit my job and stayed home most days, drinking my sorrows away the best I could. My grandparents left all the bank accounts to me, along with the house, so there really wasn't any need to work. I would wake up, stumble around in the darkness, even urinating on the floor at times. I would then scurry over to the couch. Sometimes I would turn on the television, but never really look at it. I would just take comfort in the noise it created. I did rummage around some of my grandfather's belongings, trying to resurrect that deep connection I had with him, my once hero. I didn't find anything of significance, though I did discover an odd sketch he had folded up in his wallet. A bizarre design of lines going in different directions. At first glance, it looked a bit like a puzzle. I didn't know why, but I stashed it in my pocket, perhaps a feeble attempt in trying to reconnect with the man that taught me so much. It wasn't until one night, I was about 14 beers in, and realized I'd run out of alcohol. I practically destroyed the kitchen, looking for something to drink. It was past curfew to buy more, but it was just too early for me to stop. This is when I remembered the second fridge we had out in the garage. I hadn't been in there for months, but figured maybe there was some leftover Chardonnay my grandmother left. It was a long shot, but being sober was something I was not comfortable with. I stumbled across the kitchen, kicking empty beer cans out of the way as the stench of rotting food simmered around me. I entered the dark and elongated corridor that led to the garage. As I walked through, I collided against the walls as I did my best to stable my balance. That's when I remembered the mystery of the garage. I remembered being so frightened of this corridor, always letting my imagination get the better of me. This time, in my drunken state, I laughed at the fictional ghost that haunted me. As I angrily swung at the dead air, I stopped after a few seconds. I was already out of breath. Nothing was there. Nothing was ever there. I spent years being scared of the darkness, but in actuality, I was afraid of the emptiness, something I was now faced with. I entered the small garage. I didn't bother turning on any lights. A bit of the moon shined through a small window that resided towards the ceiling. Enough light to guide me to my destiny. More alcohol. To my delight, I did find something. It wasn't Chardonnay or even beer, but it would do the job. I had found some champagne. I chuckled, thinking of what I was going to celebrate, solitude or insanity. I had a good laugh and closed the fridge door. I then started walking back to the corridor, when in the moonlight did I see one of those hideous statues. I had completely forgotten about them, and I fell backwards on the floor from being startled, clashing down with a heavy thud. Luckily, I didn't break my bottle. As I sat on the floor, I began looking around, searching for more of those little demons, but it was only the one. As usual, the woman looked terrified. I promptly got up off the floor and headed towards the sculpture, picking it up and raising it over my head with malice, intent ready to destroy the horrid creation. But then stopped myself, thinking of how much my grandfather cherished these things. My head dipped with defeat, sorrow pouring out of my heart. I could feel tears slipping down my face as I shuffled my way back to the corridor. I was ready to collapse back down onto the couch and drink until I blacked out, wishing never to wake up, to remain in the world of slumber, or even better, in the realm of nothingness. As the dark thoughts swirled around my mind, something caught my attention, which was the corridor seemed to be longer than usual, and suddenly my misery quickly morphed into befuddlement. I began walking a bit faster, as the shadows that mocked me mere minutes ago now seemed to be gaining on me. I soon collided with the door. A sense of relief washed over me as I giggled from how silly I was being. I opened the door and stepped through. To my astonishment, I was back in the garage. What the hell? I whimpered out as I still held my bottle of champagne. I shook my head, thinking now maybe I had drank too much. So I headed back towards the door, this time a bit more aware. I walked down the dark-infested corridor, and like before, it felt longer. I had quickened my pace, but tried to keep my cool, understanding this was all some alcohol-induced hallucination. I outstretched my arm, in the pitch darkness, waiting to feel the firmness of the door. After what felt like minutes, I finally felt it. I quickly stepped through, and to my dismay, I was back in the garage, though this time I wasn't alone. There were more of those disgusting statues, at least 10 of them, all staring at me with their gross, terrified expressions. That wasn't all. The garage itself seemed bigger, as if it had increased in space, but even more disturbingly, was I now saw another door. My heart must be racing a million miles an hour, as I finally relinquished my bottle and grasped at my head in confusion. The sounds of my champagne shattering on the floor rung out like church bells. This is when my memory gets a bit foggy. I don't remember much, and a cloud of haze inundated my vision. All I could do is sob, and I passed out. I awoke on the kitchen floor. The cold marble soothed my burning body. As the sunlight seeped in through the windows, I had the hugest headache, but I remembered everything that I had seen. I stood to my feet, my body cradled back and forth trying to gain my balance. I stared over at the corridor and felt fear creep into my very soul. I thought of one of the statues. Were they keeping me there? Did they not want me to escape? I didn't know what to think, but I knew what I wasn't going to do, and that was let them stop me from drinking. After leaving the house for the first time in weeks to get more beer, I pondered on my own experience. I spent most of the day doing my best to convince myself that it was all some gruesome nightmare. It was indicative of how lonely and sad I was. So I kept to my routine, sitting on my couch in the dark as I bought myself some smokes, something I didn't do often, but figured why not do the things that could lead to my death quicker. I spent most of the night drinking and smoking. You can probably guess that I was truly at rock bottom. I even entertained the idea of ending it all. A strong thought seemed to keep crawling its way back into the forefront of my thoughts, and that was that damn garage. I needed to know if what I saw was real. Was this what my grandfather meant when he would get lost in the garage? I put my smoke down on the couch and stormed towards the dark corridor, with only the moonlight shining through the windows to guide me. I gripped the doorknob to the mystifying space tightly as I deeply inhaled, scared of what truths I might uncover. I cautiously made my way down the darkened and vacant corridor, treading carefully not to encounter some ghastly entity. As I finally came to the garage, I held my breath and entered. As always, it was dimly lit, isolated. Sound seemingly unable to escape the clutches of this small space. I looked around carefully, being ready for the unexpected, but didn't see anything out of ordinary. Not even those dreadful statues. I slapped myself against the head and berated myself for being so impractical, thinking anything different would reveal itself, and I headed back towards my kitchen. As I entered the dark corridor, the now familiar sensation of endless walking invaded my sense, as I knew I had returned to the nightmarish realm of uncertainty. Making my way back to the door, I once again was back in the garage. I repeated this several times, and ended up in the same, back in the poorly moonlit room. After about 5 attempts, I was finally face to face with those demonic statues. But this time, they didn't look like how they usually did. Instead, they were human-sized, about 5 feet tall, while their bodies contorted in disfigured positions, frozen in place by some unnatural force. Staring at their faces, their lifelike features still projected terror. More alarming, as how tears seemed to slip down their porcelain skin the closer that I got to them. This is when I finally saw the extra door. I could feel fear doing its best to conquer me, but I had to know where I was. Perhaps this was the afterlife, and only by passing through more doors would I be able to see my grandfather. So I entered the mysterious additional door, ready to encounter whatever creature this world felt like dishing at me. As I slithered my way around the disturbing, life-size statues, I began to hear the faintest sound. It sounded like a melody, as if someone was humming, but more specifically, a woman humming a song. It was coming from the new door. I couldn't tell you why, but I felt attracted to the soft voice, like a mosquito attracted to one of those blue light traps. And with that, I proceeded to the door. As usual, stepping through was the all too familiar corridor, and I walked down now with much more confidence than trepidation. Stepping back into the garage, I could see how much bigger it had expanded. It was practically the size of a small warehouse. Luckily, those horrid sculptures were gone, and I found myself alone. I felt like exploring around, but quickly saw that there were now 2 additional doors. I contemplated which one I should venture through, but then heard the vague sound of humming, and I decided to follow the beautiful sound. I traveled through door after door, getting closer to that beatific harmony, wanting to know who was creating it. I no longer saw any statues, but the once small garage only grew to the size of an abandoned building, while revealing at least 10 extra doors to me. Though my choose of a door was simple, I continued following the beautiful sound of music, my soul guiding me towards whatever afterlife I deserved, and after several more trips down the rabbit hole, finally did I get to the realm that was bigger than anything imaginable, a void in space that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe. This wasn't a garage, but rather a new world. Something in the back of my mind captured me. The melody sounded too familiar. "Hello?" I shouted out, hoping whoever was making such an angelic noise would respond. That's when the humming had stopped. I narrowed my eyes, hoping to see anyone, and that's when I spotted a bit of movement. It was a person, or at least I presumed it was. In fact, it looked like a woman. "Hello, please," I pleaded as the figure seemed to be running away from me. "Am I dead?" I asked. Finally, the person stopped to look at me, their face being disguised in the shadows of this realm. As I approached closer, lights seemed to follow me, as if I projected some energy, shining the small space that encapsulated my area. Finally, the person's features were revealed to me. It was a woman about my age. Something about her felt emotional, like I knew her. As my eyes followed her movements, I clearly saw the fear consuming her face. She was terrified, at least for the first few minutes, and after a moment her body relaxed and realized that I was of no threat. "I thought you were him," the woman told me. "What are you talking about? Who is him?" I asked. She just continued looking at me with wonderment, as if I were some alien from another planet. The more I reflected on the moment, it came to me why that song sounded so familiar, and with bewilderment gaping out of my mouth, I had to know who this person was. "That song you were humming. My mother used to sing that song to me when I was little," I told the strange woman. She remained a bit reserved, but then smiled. In the moment I realized how distraught she appeared. Her hair was unkempt, disheveled, dark rings sagged underneath her ocean blue eyes, while her posture seemed to tremble without control. "I used to sing that song to my son, before..." She paused. No, this was impossible. I had to be dead, or at least in some coma of sorts. That's it. I had drank too much and passed out on the couch as I consumed my smokes. Though staring at the woman's face, I realized she looked a lot like me. Mom? I yelped out. She shuddered in place at such a comment, but then stared at me as she tilted her head side to side. No, my son is 5 years old, she told me. It started to make more sense. She must have got lost in here, whatever place this was. That's where she had gone. This is why my grandfather always came here. He must have been looking for her. It's me, Mom. You've been missing for about 20 years. Everyone thought you were dead, I told her, but with a shaky tone. She grasped at her mouth, seemingly in shock, but her eyes portrayed a look of belief. She now knew who I was. Has it been that long? I tried to find my way out. I wanted to get back to you, but every time I was close, he would drag me back in, deeper and deeper each time. My mother told me to my bewilderment. Who is he? I don't know who you're talking about. Is there someone else in here with you? Is it my dad? I asked her. That's when in the corner of my eyes, I picked up movement. Movement in the dark or getting closer. I gulped heavy from fear, not knowing what was approaching. But as the darkness dissipated from my energy, I clearly saw it was more women. Dozens and dozens of them, getting closer to me and my mother. Wait, who are they? What's going on, Mom? I trembled with disgust as I grabbed at my mother, like some kid wanting shelter from monsters. Don't be afraid. He brought them here too. There's many of us. Some are in different realms. I don't know how big this place is, but I know there might be hundreds of us, my mother said. As the women got closer, I could see their distraught faces, all of them revealing a look of despair, and that's when it dawned on me. They were the statues. They looked just like them. I didn't understand how it was possible, but that's when my mother placed her hands on my face and gravitated my stare towards her. Your grandfather brought them here. He brought me here too. When I was younger, I caught him in the garage. He had a woman tied up. It was clear what he intended to do with her. I yelled at him, begging him to release her. I always knew that my father was a sick man, but I didn't know how depraved he really was. Realizing that I now knew the truth, he grabbed me and pulled me in deeper, into whatever this place is. At first, I tried my best to find a way out, but after a while, it felt useless. Occasionally, your grandfather would come down here to visit the girls, and I would follow him, wanting to know how to escape. I would always get so close. I knew I was so close, but he would always catch me and drag me back here. I'm not the only one. Plenty of us have tried to find a way out, and I think some of us had, because they disappeared unless my father did something to them. The statues. That's what happens to them when they get close, when they almost find their way out. And no, I would throw them away. Was I killing them? I began to shake my head in disagreement, not being able to accept such a story. I could feel my stomach turning in knots, along with the sudden urge to vomit. No. Impossible. My grandfather wouldn't have done that, no. I shouted as I began to sob into my mother's embrace. That's when I smelled an odd odor. I saw the other women looking around, presumably smelling the same thing. What is that? My mother asked. That's when I realized it was the scent of smoke. I remembered leaving my lit cigarette on the couch, and that's when I saw a bit of smoke simmer down the empty sky above. We have to get out of here, I told the women. No, there's no way out. I'm sorry, son, but you're stuck here too, my mom told me. You don't understand. I think the house is on fire. I don't know what happens if this place gets burned down. We have to go. That's when a spark of resolution ignited in my mind. The weird design I found in my grandfather's wallet. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. Looking at it, I saw that it was a map. The intricate turns was like one giant maze. But with this, I saw the way out. I know how to get out of here, Mom, I frantically yelled as I grabbed my mother by the hand, dragging her along with me. By this point, the stench of ash strengthened, while the daze of heavy smoke became more visible, even blocking my vision. I did my best to interpret the hand-drawn map, choosing each door carefully, not wanting to backtrack. I could see some of the girls were getting left behind, but honestly, I didn't care. All that mattered was my mother. I gripped her hand tightly, not wanting to let go, afraid of her being gone once again. I don't know how I knew. Perhaps it was the cloud of smoke that inundated the air, or maybe intuition. But I knew we were close, seeing the garage slowly shrinking back to its normal size. We were almost there, and I smiled with excitement. That's when my mother stopped, yanking her hand away from mine. "What are you doing? We just have one more door," I told her. "We can't leave the other girls behind. We need to go back for them." I looked around and realized it was just us. Everyone else seemingly wasn't able to keep up. I got a bit annoyed and grabbed at my mother's hand, trying to forcefully pull her with me. "No, we have to go back. It's because of your grandfather that those poor girls are trapped here. We need to save them. And if you don't want to help me, then so be it. I'll do it myself," she angrily told me. The smoke filled the garage, to the point that I could barely make out the shape of my mother. I began choking and gasping out for air, but Mother did not relent, and she ran back into the doors. I felt dizzy. My eyes were burning from the ash, while the place itself raised in temperature. I was losing my vision, and I fell to the floor, wishing for my mother to come back. As I laid still on the floor, I could see embers of fire beginning to penetrate through the ceiling. Though I felt calm, knowing I would now enter into the eternal void of the afterlife, and I only prayed that my mother would be there. That's when a fireman burst through the garage door. He was wearing some breathing apparatus, and I assumed he must have seen me on the floor. Was the last memory that I had. I woke up in the hospital. I didn't suffer any injuries other than some smoke inhalation. I tried explaining to everyone about the garage, about the women, about my grandfather. They all just looked at me like I'd lost my marbles. And maybe I did. Apparently that cigarette I left on the couch had sparked a fire. They told me that breathing in all that smoke could have led to me having some hallucinated dream. At least that's the official explanation. But I know the truth. I drove back to the ruins of what was my home the next day. I rummaged through the wreckage, looking for any sign of the garage, and that's when I saw it. The porcelain skin glistening in the bright sunlight. I ran over to it, uncovered it, my heart beating with intent. I prayed it was her. I wanted it to be her. Looking at the statue was intact. No cracks, no scuffs. But to my dismay, it was not my mother. I looked at the face, and it was no longer terrified. Instead, its small face had a look of hope. I carry that statue everywhere I go, because hopefully it will help me find a way back. I often dream of my grandfather, and I will carry that statue into the garage, only for her to manifest into a real person. And maybe then she will smile, hug me for saving her. Perhaps that's when I will hear a humming coming from behind me. That sweet song that once cradled me to sleep. And just maybe, I will turn around, and she will be there happy to see me.